Welcome to the second video in this tutorial series on building an e-commerce website using React Redux, GraphQL, and Firebase. Now, in this video tutorial, we're going to be looking at setting up custom routing in our project using React Router DOM. I'm also going to show you how to create custom layouts for those routes, as well as creating links to and from them. So let me demo the progress that we will have made by the end of this video tutorial. So you can already notice the UI updates that we've made to the homepage. So our content on the homepage is now full width. We have a footer, and we also have a link to a registration page in our header. If you actually click this, it actually does go to another page. And of course, as you can see at the moment, it just has a H1. The registration page and functionality is something that we're going to look at in a future tutorial. Obviously, this tutorial is all about routing and implementing that in our project. Now, before we begin the tutorial, I just want to encourage you guys to check out some of our official channels, specifically our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/simpletut. But specifically, I'd like to encourage you to visit the official playlist for this tutorial series, which you can find a link to directly in the description of this video. Alternatively, you can just visit our channel and search our content. And of course, as we progress through the series at the moment, we're on the second video of this series. But as we progress through, we will be adding to this playlist. But of course, I'd just like to encourage you guys all to subscribe to our channel, because your support goes a long way in helping us to continue to provide you with this kind of content. But I'd also like to encourage you to visit the official GitHub repository for this project. If at any point you want to compare your code with the code I'm writing, then of course you can use this as a resource. Alternatively, you can just clone the project and run it locally to kind of get a feel for how this for what we're going to be building. But again, there'll be a direct link to this in the description of this video. Our official website, which is simpletut.com. Of course, we have links to all of our tutorials and open source projects available on our website. Now, before we begin, I want to show you the official documentation for the library that we're going to be using to do this, and that's React Router DOM. This happens to be one of the biggest libraries out there for React, but it's actually one of the best documented. Now, if at any point in this tutorial or any other tutorial that you find on the internet, you get stuck, then this is a great resource for you to come to, because anything that you see us coding, you can come on here, you can find the API, and you can read about it. And of course, being able to read and understand documentation is a really big part of being a good developer. The first thing that we need to do is come over to our terminal, and we need to install our new package. So to do that, I'm just going to type in npm install React Router DOM. And when I do that, it's just going to go ahead and add this to my package JSON and install it. Now that that's installed, I'm just going to restart the application. So npm run start. Okay, so before we can actually add routes to our project, we need to create our browser router, right? So to do that, let's head over to our source directory, and inside that, our index.js file. And we need to import that browser router component. We're going to import that from React Router DOM. So let's go ahead and import that. Once we have it, we need to use it. So let's wrap our app component with our browser router. And the reason that we do this is because it passes all the functionality from our React Router DOM library to our application. All right, so at this point, you're ready for me to actually show you how to implement our first routes. But before we actually start, I want to head over to app.js, and specifically, I want to show you the problem that React Router DOM is going to solve for us. So to do that, let's think a little bit ahead, and let's think about what we're going to do in the next tutorial. So in the next tutorial, we're going to build our registration page. And that is going to require an additional page because throughout this tutorial, we're building an e-commerce website. There's going to be a lot of different pages. There's going to be a cart page. There's going to be, a sign up page. And all these pages are going to require their own set of components and configuration. So at the moment, we have our application here. And at the moment, all we're rendering is our header component and our homepage component. But what happens when we want to render other components, right? But we don't want exactly all of those components to render on the same page. So to demonstrate exactly what I mean by that, let's create that registration page. I'm going to go into my pages directory and I'm going to add another folder called registration. And inside of that, I'm going to create my index.js file, and I'm going to create another style sheet, so styles SCSS. And this registration component is actually going to be a class. So let's just quickly create that. So I'm going to import React, and I'm also going to import component, going to destructure component from React. I'm also going to import that style sheet, so I'm just going to import my styles.scss, and I'm going to create my class. So it's going to be registration, and that's just going to extend component, and then we're going to have our render method, and we're just going to return some JSX. So I'm just going to return a div tag. And of course, at the bottom, we're going to need to export default registration. And it's good practice to have a line underneath our another line here. Now, at the moment, this isn't going to render anything, but I want to demonstrate that we're on another route. So I'm going to render a H1 here. And I'm just going to say this is my registration page in a H1. So let's now head back over to our app.js file. And let's see what happens when we import that component. So let's import registration from pages registration, and let's render this component underneath our homepage component. Let's head over to our web browser, and what you'll see is we have the contents of both pages rendering on our homepage, right? Which really isn't what we want. So ideally, we should only have our homepage component rendering here on our homepage, and the registration page should be the registration component should only be rendered on the registration page, and vice versa. And this is the problem that React Router solves. It looks at the current location the user is on, and it renders the correct component based on that route. So let's go ahead and implement that in our code. So to do that on app.js, we're going to import, and I'm going to import it above my components. We're going to import route from React Router DOM. Okay, so instead of rendering these components here directly, I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to render two routes. And our routes components are going to accept a couple of different arguments. The first one is going to be path. The second one is going to be component. They're pretty self-explanatory. So of course, on our homepage route, we're just going to have a path of /. And of course, the component that we want to render here is going to be our homepage component. And over here, we're also going to have another path, which is going to be /registration. And we're also going to have our component. So we're going to have our registration component. Now let's save that, and let's go ahead back to let's go back to our browser, and let's see what happens. So currently we're now getting our homepage component, right? We're not seeing that registration component render, but let's go / registration. And you're going to see that, hang on a minute, we're also seeing our homepage component, but we are seeing our registration component. We weren't getting that on our homepage. But why are we seeing our homepage component? So let's come back over to the code and figure out what's going on. So the reason is that / has also matched, right? Because what the route component does is it looks at the path and it says, does it match? Well, in actual fact, / registration does match the homepage component because it is from the base route, right? So what we actually need to do on our homepage component route is actually say exact, right? It needs to be exactly /. It cannot be / registration. That would not match. So this is an additional argument that we can pass. It accepts a Boolean value, right? So we can either say just exact, or we could even say true, or we could say false. But I'm just going to pass exact. And if I come back over to the browser now, you'll see that on the registration route, it doesn't match. So that is all we get. Now, another way of tackling this issue is actually by using another component from React Router DOM. That is the switch component. Now, the switch component needs to be wrapped around your routes. And what this component will do is it will take the first matching route and it will render it. It will not render the second one. So for example, in this case, we know that the homepage / route matched both for the homepage and the registration component. But if I remove this exact path now, if we were to go to our registration page, so let's come back over to the browser, you'll see that I'm on the registration route, but I'm not actually seeing the registration component. And the reason is because the homepage route is above the registration route. So it takes priority because the homepage route matches for both of these, right? But because this matched first, this is the one that gets returned. If I was to comment out the switch component and I come back to the browser, you'll see that I'm getting the registration component and the homepage component rendered at the same time. But again, let's come back to the code. Let's uncomment it. Because the homepage route matches first, the switch component renders that and it will not render any of the other matching routes, right? So again, if I come back to the web browser, again, I'm not seeing it. And again, this works in a priority of the first one being matched. So for example, if the registration route was above the homepage component, then that is the component that would be rendered, right? So let's come back to the code and let's just reorder that. So we want to put our homepage route first. But again, we need to pass that exact prop. Let's come back to the browser and you're going to see that we're now seeing the routes render correctly. So we're seeing the registration route rendered for our registration page. And again, if we come back to the home page, we're going to only see our homepage route rendered, which is what we want. All right, so at this point, we have actually implemented routing in our project. But something that I want to cover in addition to routing in this tutorial is our layouts and the ability to have custom layouts for different routes. And this is actually something that is going to be very important as your application grows. I'm certain that in this tutorial series alone, when it comes to pages like our sign up registration, our login pages, I want to implement a different layout. Now, what am I talking about when I say layout, right? So as you know, we have our pages, and currently our pages, for example, for the home page, it contains, if we look at this in the browser, it really only contains the part of the page that sits between the header and footer. And the reason is that if you look at a site generally, the only parts of the site that will change is the bit between the header and footer. Okay, so throughout the site, the header and footer will remain the same on all of our pages. There may be some exceptions. They may change slightly, but in general, that is a pretty consistent pattern that websites follow. The header and footer remain the same. The content in between is what changes. But that doesn't mean that you are not going to have for example, a promotional page or a landing page that requires a completely different layout. And if that was the case, then this current implementation would actually present some challenges, right? Because the parts of that we're changing based on the route currently are only that midsection. So the other parts of our layout for our header sit outside of that. So regardless of what route the user is on, they're always going to get the header component. They're always going to have a div with this particular class of main. And that main class is actually applying a CSS max width. So again, if I look at that in the browser, this main class is applying a max width, right? And maybe on a particular page, this would present another styling issue that you would want to address, right? Because maybe you want this to be, full width. You don't want it to have this particular restriction. So how can we actually combat that? Well, let's take a look at that in the code. Let's create a different layout that we can apply. So to do that, I'm going to refactor this code. So I'm going to take, first of all, on app.js, I'm going to take everything, basically our switch component and our routes. I'm going to remove the header and the div with the main class. I'm going to remove it. And all I'm going to render on app.js is my switch component and the routes. That's all I'm going to render. So I can also remove the import for the header component on my app.js file. Now, if I look again at the web browser, I'm literally only rendering the directory component now. I'm rendering the page component. And similarly, if I was on the registration page, I'd only be rendering the registration page. So I'm no longer seeing my header. So how do I bring that back? So let's come back over to the code. And we need to create a new folder within the source directory called layouts. And within layouts, I'm going to have a new file. This is going to be my main layout.js, right? And this is actually just going to be a functional component. So I'm going to import React from React. And I'm just going to create a const called main layout. And it's just going to equal again, a functional component, so we'll pass props equals a function where we're going to return. And before I come to that, I'm going to export default main layout. So all we want to do here, right, is really just render the children, right? But we want to build our layout first. So let's replicate what we had before. So I'm going to have my header. So I'm going to import my header from, and let's import this from components header, and we'll return that. So we need to have a div here, but we're gonna render our header, and then we're going to have another div like we had before with the class of main, and inside of this we're going to render our children. So we'll say props.children. All right, so let's see what happens. So let's return to our app.js, and let's see how we can utilize this layout, right? So I'm going to import my layouts here. So let's say layouts, and these are our pages. So let's import our layouts. So I'm going to import my main layout from, and again, you go into layouts and then main layout. Okay, so to actually render this, we're going to have to do it a little bit differently. So before we use this component prop, we're going to use a render. So we're just going to use this to actually render our layout. So to do that, let's go ahead and do it. Let's just say we want to render our main layout, and in between that, we're going to render our homepage component, and we'll do the same thing for our registration route. So we'll replace component with render, and again, this allows us to just render our main layout component, and we'll pass the child of this will be our registration route. Okay. So now let's come back over to our browser, and let's see how it's rendered. Okay, so this might look a little bit strange to you, but it's actually working. I'm going to explain what's going on here. So let's just inspect the page, and what you'll remember is that in the previous tutorial, we created, our CSS has just collapsed on itself. We set a lot of the wrappers to have a height of 100%. And because of this main layout component does not have that CSS property of 100% height, it's kind of just collapsed on itself. So we just need to apply that. So to do that, I'm just going to add that CSS property to this particular div. So if I come back over to main layout, our JS file, on this wrapper here, this div, I'm going to have a class name here of full height, and I'm just going to come back over to let's say the default CSS, and I'm going to add this class full height to this particular style. And when I do that, I can come back to the browser again. Let's refresh the page, and you'll see that everything renders normally as expected. And again, let's have a look at the registration page. And again, as you can see, it all renders as we expect it to. But what if, there was a difference, a change that we wanted to implement here? So for example, let's come back over here, and let's say that I wanted a different layout. So maybe I wanted a layout for my home page. I could create another layout file. I could say homepage layout.js, and I'm just going to copy, to save some time, I'm going to copy the contents of main layout into my homepage layout. And I'm just going to rename the function. So this will be my homepage layout, and I'm going to export that. And the change I'm going to make here is I'm going to remove this the main class here. I'm going to remove that entire wrapper. So that would effectively make my homepage content full width. And I'm going to come back to my main layout, and this doesn't need to have this full height. So I'll remove that. Now to utilize that, I'm going to come to app.js, And I'm going to, first of all, I'm going to import that new layout. So this is my home page layout from layouts, home page layout. And rather than wrap my home page component with the main layout, I'm going to wrap it with the home page layout. Let's come back over to the browser and see how that's affected the site. So as you can see, I'm getting my full page, my home page is now full width. But also, if I come to the registration page, so my registration route, I'm getting the header component rendered as normal. So that's unaffected, but I get the normal layout structure that I want. So that's awesome. We've now successfully implemented routing into our project, and we've also got custom layouts for different pages. The last thing that I want to show you is how you can actually create links between your different routes, because that may be slightly different to what you're used to. So let's come back into our header component, and what I want to do is I want to create a link to the registration page, right? Because so far at the moment I've just been manually typing in the address into the browser. So let's create a link. So to do that, we're going to use another component that is given to us from React Router DOM. And that is the link component. Okay, so within the header component, I'm going to create another div. And I'm just going to call this my call to actions. And what this is going to contain is another, we're going to have an unordered list with some list items. Okay, and let's utilize this new link component. So I'm just going to use the link component, and the text we want to insert here is going to be register. And again, this is going to be something we create this registration page in the next tutorial. But for now, what we want to do is we want to set the path that this link is going to take the user. So we'll use the to argument here. It's going to pass a string, just / to our registration routes. Now, before I move on, I also want to wrap my logo in a link. So I'm going to add a link here. I'm going to send the user to the home page whenever this is clicked or selected. So let's come back to the browser and let's just see what that looks like. So as you can see over here, there's absolutely no styling on it at the moment, but we have a register link. If I click that, it takes me to the registration route. And if I click the logo, it takes me back to the home page. That's awesome. Let's just add some styling to it. So let's come back to the header component, and we have our call to actions class we can target. So let's come back here. In our header, we have our wrap, we have our logo. So after the logo, we'll add our call to actions, and we'll say position absolute. We want to be from the right about 10 pixels to keep in our site margins. Let's make this from the top something like 50%. Do another transform here just to center it. We'll take that same, we'll just reuse that styling. So this is just going to transform translate with the fullbacks for Moz and WebKit. With the top of 50%, when you position absolute, this will actually center it vertically for you, as long as the parent is has a relative position. And then we'll just target the UL and LI, and we'll just make sure that they have 0 margin and 0 padding. But we'll also then we're gonna also target the LI alone, and we want to make sure that the list style type is none. But also what we want to do is just target that link and add some styling. And although we're using and this is actually an interesting point, although we have okay, so some of the styling, obviously I'm using hot reloading, so it's taking place. But although we have used that link component, I just want to show you that it is still a normal anchor tag when it's rendered on the page. Let's come back over to our editor again, just target a normal anchor tag here. And I'm going to set this to a font size of about 18 pixels. Again, we're using rems. We'll just set the line height to 1. We'll set the color to black for now. And what we want to do is also add a text decoration of none and a text transform of uppercase. Great. Let's just come back over to the browser again. Let's just look at what that looks like here. That looks good. Right, so we have our links now in place. We can click to and from the home page. At this point, we've managed to implement routing, custom layouts into our project, and that's fantastic. But the last remaining, now as a bonus section to this tutorial, I'm going to go ahead and create the footer component so that I can show you how to implement new components into our layouts. And we're going to come into our source folder, we're going to go into components, and we're going to create a new folder called footer. And again, this is going to require an index.js file and a styles file, SCSS. It is going to be a functional component, so I'm going to import React from React, and we're going to create a functional component. So it's going to be const footer equals a function. Just going to pass props, and we will return a footer. So export default footer, and of course we're going to add a class here of footer. And what we'll do is we're going to take this footer component, and of course you can add any kind of content you want into your footer. For me, I'm just going to add a wrapper here. And this is going to center the content, and I'm just going to have some text, which is going to be a simple copyright notice. Now let's import this and use this on our layout. So to do that, we're going to come over to our layout. Let's implement this first of all on our home page. So the same way I imported the header here, I'm going to import the footer from the components folder. And we're going to put that just below where we render the children. I'm also going to do the same thing in the main layout.js file. So let's go ahead and import the footer here, again from the components folder. And again, we're going to render this one below the main div tag here. Let's come back over to our home page, and you'll see that it is there. It doesn't look like too much at the moment. And if we click on the register link here, you can see we have it here too. So let's come back over to our Simpletut page here, and let's implement this here. It's just some CSS, and I'm going to first of all just add some styling. So I'm going to target the footer, and I'm going to then target the wrap. We're going to add the same margins, so we're going to set a max width of 1450, and we're going to center it with 0 auto, and we'll probably add some padding too. So let's add some padding, something like maybe 20 pixels top and bottom, and 10 pixels left and right. So let's see what that looks like in the browser. not actually taking effect. All right, so we need to come back over here to our footer component. We haven't imported the style sheet, so we need to import styles.scss. Come back to the browser, and you'll see now that it is taking effect. But you can't see it on the page, and that's just to do with the way that we styled this to make it full width, right? So to do that, the fix will be, we need to come to our home page, styles, and we did this height calculation here. So originally it was set to 100%, but what we did was we did a calculation. We took away the height of the header from the height of the viewport, and that gave us the remaining pixels to fill the screen. So we need to also take away the height of the footer, which is another 58 pixels. So let's come back to our code editor, and let's take away 58 pixels, so 5.8 rem. When we do that, you'll see that now on the page, rendered perfectly. We have the footer, we have the header, and we have the main content, which is the height, the perfect height of the page. So let's also look at the registration page. And also, of course, as you can see, we are also getting the same result. And that brings us to the end of this video tutorial. So before we sign off, let's just check in our code. So these are obviously all the changes that I've made. Let's commit those. So git add all, do a git status, git commit. And let's just say this was a React router and custom layouts and our footer component. Check that in, do a git status again, and let's do a git push. And as you can see, I'm going to be pushing it to this branch. And that brings us to the end of this video tutorial. Just to recap the things that we've achieved, we've managed to implement React routing into our application. We've created custom layouts. We created our footer component, and I even showed you how to set up some links between two different pages. But in the next tutorial, we are going to be looking at that sign up workflow. So once again, thank you for watching this video tutorial, and I look forward to catching you in the next one.